Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's INSEAD webinar on the implications for the work phase of COVID-19. My name is Natalie Einhoff. I'm a director at Barclays working in the payments organization. And then I'm also one of the co-chairs of INSEAD's Alumni Career Group. So this evening, I'm pleased to welcome two distinguished guests to speak with us this evening about a topic that's very much front and center for many of us during this pandemic. And really it's, what are the implications to individuals and organizations of the unprecedented events that have taken on, that have happened since the beginning of the year. Before we get into that and doing the intros, just a couple of minor admin points. So we are going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So you'll see that you've got some features at the bottom to either ask us questions, so you can submit a question and we will aim to answer it. And you can also use the chat feature to chat to us or chat amongst yourself. We will also be leaving a little bit of time towards the end for Q&A, so you can either ask your question kind of as we're discussing, or feel free to save it for the end. Good. So let's get started. If I can get Shivani to introduce yourself, please.
Good evening, everyone. Shivani Maitra. I'm a partner in Deloitte. I lead the private sector practice for human capital in London.
Great, thank you. And Dominic?
Hello, everybody. I'm Dominic Endicott. I'm a partner at 4Gen Ventures, which is a new venture capital firm that's focused on the longevity economy and increasingly also the future of work.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for being here for this conversation with us. So most, if not all, of the people that are on this call will likely transition to a much more virtual environment over the last couple of weeks due to the lockdowns, and even now, as we see economies starting to open up, the return to office for non-key workers is still quite a way away. We all saw a bit of a frenzy of activity when all of this happened. There was network upgrades, there was collaboration tools that were rolled out as people really adapted to this in very much a survival mode, right? How do we keep our workers and our employees and our companies going when we have to be virtual and we can't travel to our offices? Now, as some of that has shifted and we're moving into a slightly different world, we're starting to think about, how much of these changes are actually going to be long-lasting, right? So what is the world going to take with it as we move into the next phase of this? So one of the most obvious implications of this has obviously been the massive shift to working from home. So I'm going to ask the audience with a poll questions, and I'm also going to ask you guys, what do you view as the prospects for working from home? Some companies like Twitter have publicly said that they're going to be having their employees working from home on a permanent basis, and a lot of people have reacted quite positively to this. So do you see it that we will eventually be moving to a more fully virtual environment? Or how do you see this evolving? I don't know who wants to take that first, Shivani or Dominic?
I'm happy for Dominic to go first in this instance.
Okay, I'd be happy to. So my perspective is before COVID, for example, in the US, maybe only 5% of people were really working from home in a permanent way. And it's now probably among knowledge workers, it's close to 80%, but I think across all workers, it's easily 60% or so. What's interesting is if you actually look at the amount of work that was being done at home before COVID in the US, it was already 30%, and that's now doubled to about 65%. So the fact that there's already a lot of work from home, it's all those emails and projects that were done in the morning and late at night and on the weekend. And so that shift had already really happened. It's just been accelerated. My sense is that when, in a sense, COVID moves to a more stable situation, which could take another year or so, probably the work from home will be still in the 40% range. I suspect there will be a return back to the office. I also believe that one of the big effects as companies take advantage of this and look at the cost reduction opportunity is that companies will become much more liberal about where people live, and people will take full advantage of that and move to lower cost places to raise their families. And so I think you're going to see a much more distributed work. And one of the things you might start to see is really kind of a distributed co-working model where companies contract with co-working centers closer to where people live so that they can get away from home and get a little bit of that social capital that is so critical. And therefore you may have sort of three locations: the home, the local place, which is probably going to be a shared place, not just from your own co-workers, but actually others, so a co-working space, and then the sort of central points where you get together maybe once a week or once a month or on a regular basis to make sure you are kind of building those social networks that are still critical with your co-workers.
Thank you for that, Dominic. And I think this brings me on to the question that I was going to ask you, Shivani, which is, you advise a lot of corporations. So, what has been top of mind as they've witnessed this? Dominic made reference just now to, thinking about their location strategy, thinking about recruitment. What have your conversations been about when it comes to those two topics?
So I think, Natalie, we are having these conversations with clients, but we have 25,000 people in Deloitte in the UK. And we are having this same conversation internally. So it's very interesting to see where the points of similarity are. I think it's important that we understand that there are actually two types of worker groups. One are the knowledge workers who have always worked out of the office, or whatever we tend to call the traditional office, and those who have to be elsewhere. These are people in stores, these are people in the field, typically salespeople, and similar. For the second category, nothing has really changed. We've had our local grocers and pharmacies and essential services still open, and people have been going to work. How much things change for them remains to be seen. The big shift has happened with the knowledge or the typical office workers. I think the big change that has happened is that the culture of presenteeism has very quickly disappeared. A lot of people would have liked to work from home, would not have wanted to take that difficult 1-hour commute into the city, but they had to, because if you were not at work, then you were not working. There was this very strong sense of it. What has happened is, and we've done a lot of research, both within Deloitte, but also with many of our clients, and in the main, productivity, and we can discuss how we define productivity, but productivity has remained and in some cases gone up for a lot of organizations. A lot of people we've surveyed have said that once the pandemic is over, and I completely agree with Dominic, it's going to take us a year, 18 months for things to get back to normal. People will voluntarily decide to work from home increasingly. And I think we are averaging 35 to 40% of the time working from home. And again, how seamless that interaction between virtual, which is when you're at home, and the physical when you're in the office space, how that happens will be seen, because right now organizations are using whatever's available, be it Zoom, Slack, MS Teams. There are a variety of things, but the end-to-end seamless solution isn't there. So there's something needs to happen. I guess that's one big thing that's going to happen. The second thing, again, just to build on Dominic's point around people will choose to move out of the big cities. I think there's going to be a big impact on diversity in the right way, because it opens up talent pools for organizations, and you're not waiting for people to move to a London or a New York or a Berlin or whatever it might be. People can live anywhere and come work for you, and it works both ways. So you can live, and we have these cases now where we've hired people from really small towns who have worked they've been inducted virtually, and they've started work virtually, working out of small towns and villages in Scotland, for instance, and they've not had to move to Edinburgh. So for them, the access to a large organization and being able to work for a large organization without having to completely turn over their life and their lifestyles, that's not going to be required. So I think the whole talent narrative will have to change. It's not about coming into a fancy building to have expensive coffee. It's going to be about choose where you live and still work for the organization you want to work. I think we're looking at the coming of age of a more egalitarian society in some ways.
If I could maybe sort of add two couple of thoughts from what you're saying. One is, for example, in London, and you see that in Boston and New York, a lot of sort of more senior and wealthier people have already had this sort of flexible model where they could sort of be away from the city and then come to the city maybe once a week to sort of have a whole bunch of meetings and then go back. And I suspect that that is going to get democratized and more people will have that opportunity. And I think it will still be critical to be in a face-to-face environment because some of the best ideas and value creation is going to happen in those kinds of events, but it will be more something that people can choose rather than doing it every day just because they have to show up in the office to the point of presenteeism. And then the second point, I think it would be really interesting to see how the white collar moves impact, say, the blue collar and some of the service economy moves. Enrico Moretti has done this work on the new geography of jobs, and he talks about a 5-to-1 multiplier in the sense that, you know, apex type jobs like, you know, high level technical jobs tend to have a 5-to-1 multiplier effect because if say a bunch of very senior people move to a new location, they in turn generate jobs for school teachers and baristas and people in stores. And so I think over time, you may see a new geography of some of these jobs that today tend to be concentrated in the cities also moving out. But exactly how that's going to happen, I think, is a big uncertainty.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I love what you're saying about the benefits of getting rid of that presenteeism, right? And the potential benefit that you're getting to diversity. This is one of the questions I had for later on, but I think we might get to it now, which is, how do you think this situation has impacted or is benefiting, you know, either women or other minorities from a diversity perspective, right? Some people, I've heard them say it both ways, that it's, in some ways it's leveling the playing field, right? Because you're going into virtual environments and everybody's kind of at the table and they can come and they can raise their hands. But I've heard it otherwise, that some of the costs and the homeschooling and all of that has unfairly fallen into the women's side of things. So do you see, beyond what you just said about that greater access to the talent pool and it being quite great, other impacts to diversity?
So Natalie, that's a really interesting point, because we spoke to our disability group that we have within Deloitte, and they have said they've never felt more equal, because at the end of the day, everybody is a little box on a screen, and that's what it amounts to. So for them personally, they feel they've benefited, and organizations specifically with this group have responded very quickly in making sure they have the right equipment, right? Yeah. While you still figure out your policy for other people, for this particular group, they've benefited. So I think to the term Dominic used around democratization, that has happened. Our women have responded slightly differently. I think they have struggled, especially with this whole uncertainty about schools and when they'll open and when they won't. Actually, any parent, and I don't want to single women out, I think parents in general have struggled. But I don't suppose this will continue as a problem, because at some stage schools will open and children will start going back to school. And I think in that, with that happening, women will benefit, because as you said, typically they are the ones who are dropping kids off to school and picking them up from daycare and all of that. They will have more flexibility, because then they are not dropping their child off to school and then rushing to catch the next train to get into work. They can just go home, right? Which is probably closer to where the schools are. So I think in the long term, it will benefit parents, it will benefit people who have disabilities and have to really make an effort to come into work, right? And the third bit is a lot of our people, you know, who are introverts, who generally don't respond well to too many people and having to deal with too much of teaming and all of that. they are finding this honeymoon period really well. But on the flip side, I worry if on a screen there are 20 people on a Zoom call, do they still raise their hands and talk? So I think something needs to be done there. I'm not sure if it's benefiting the BAME community in particular. I think one thing that I regret is that through the pandemic, the other thing that's happened is the whole Black Lives Matter movement. And if I had been in the workplace, I would have caught onto the pulse of my team a lot quicker and would have responded a lot better. I think my response was a bit delayed. And yes, we had some fabulous discussions, and we are now, doing things around it. But if we had been together in the physical space, it would have been a little different.
Yeah.
So I think we just need to be careful that, I won't have the pulse of my team at all points in time if there is increased virtual working. So we have to figure out a way how we address that.
Yeah, and we're going to move to some of the disadvantages in a second. But before I close off on benefits, Dominic, anything you want to add on benefits that we've seen during the pandemic? And then I'm going to open up a poll to the audience as well as to what they see some of the benefits of this flexible working being.
I mean, I think I would certainly point to the ability to very quickly sort of get on an event like this and bring people from all over the world and exchange knowledge in ways that used to be done in completely offline ways that are now being done online. And I think we're working through issues like how do you manage a 20-person or a 500-person Zoom. So I think we have to build this new etiquette and new models, but it's amazing that it's happening. And I sort of think of it as the good enough economy, right? Like it had to be perfect. Now it's good enough and it's working pretty well. And I think that points out to opportunity. You also see that, for example, in sales, like figuring out how to do sales is a new challenge, but it's being done. And so we're learning all these very interesting digital skills. I think everybody's had a big upgrade in digital skills because they've had to. I think that's going to be very good.
Yeah, and I would say, probably for a lot of our grandparents or parents and things like that who hadn't embraced these tools before, they've definitely had to embrace them right now. So I've seen that. Right, I'm going to ask the audience, and then while we're waiting for them to answer, I also wanted to share with you that we did get the results of the first poll when I asked how many of the audience here expect to be working from home themselves. We had over 50% saying that they would work 1 or 2 days from home, and then about 30% working 2 to 4 days from home, and very much a minority on either end wanting to go back to either all week in the office or all week at home, right? So hopefully once we do move towards this new normal, it is going to be that blending of, what have we actually gained through this time. So good to see that in this poll here. I'm going to close the poll on the screen and share the results with you all. And by far the winner is really that benefit to the work-life balance. Probably not a huge surprise to us, because obviously something we've benefited from as well. But also the access to the greater talent pool, productivity and cost savings. So I think on that, maybe Shivani, you talked earlier a little bit about productivity and how we're measuring productivity, right? And we kind of knew each other. We knew what we were working on. So we all went home and actually we could be productive. How do you see us potentially having to look at different ways of managing productivity as we move into this new world of working?
I think first of all, Natalie, I think we need to redefine productivity, and it'll vary by organization. But I think right now the definition of productivity is very singular in most organizations. It's driven by hardcore numbers. Have you hit your sales target? Have you met your revenue target? Have you done your cost savings? Very hardcore numbers driven. Productivity will need to be measured in a far more broader sense. So you will have to start looking at team effectiveness, employee morale, amongst other things. I mean, these are just two examples that really come to mind. So the definition of productivity will have to be a bit broader. you know, I do so much transformation work, and that's what I've done for the last 22 odd years. And it's hard. It takes years. And, you know, change is difficult, change is tough. And then you get into the whole decision-making process where, you know, you sit in an exec or a board meeting and you're going through the pros and cons of taking certain decisions. And the pandemic has really, really put up a mirror on how that's not really required, because organizations were able to pivot their business models overnight. I would have loved to be a fly on a wall for some of these organizations that have given me such a hard time when it comes to decision making, but that wasn't the case now, right? Overnight, they decided how they were going to get people to work from home, how they were going to, you know, change the job profile for some of their people. And that happened overnight, and everybody signed up to it. So what was the big shift that happened where your barriers to change just disappeared, but equally you as a decision-making leadership team were able to come to a common point of agreement so quickly? I think you need to figure that out, because I think that's going to play a big role in productivity. I guess the other thing is, you know, we do talk about productivity going up, and that's because everybody's been very outcome focused.
Yeah.
The problem that's happened in the past is people are just so obsessed with doing tasks and ticking off a checklist. And that's what's defined. And that's how performance measures have been defined, not just for an individual, but for a team, and then ultimately an organization. Now, the objective, the mission, has been so clear that teams have come together to say, we need to do this, and they've done it. So it's been very outcome focused. And I think that's going to play a big role in defining productivity. I think that's where the shift will happen, start to happen.
And I think it's interesting what you say about that common purpose, right? And it comes to something we were talking about with you a while ago, Dominic, also about, you know, your shift towards thinking about society and having that social purpose to organizations, right? So I think for a while companies have been grappling with, what's my company's purpose, and I need to give my employees that purpose. There really was a purpose here, and we saw what we were able to achieve, right? Dominic, for the organizations that you work with that tend to be more you know, startup or different phases, you know, have you seen this in your world as well?
I think I've seen several things starting, and I think there's a lot more to come. I think one of the things that we've started to see is that traditional tech entrepreneurs are saying, for the next tour of duty, I want to still do tech, but I want to do it with a social impact. And so I think you're seeing a big shift there. And I think it's happening faster in the tech world and the entrepreneurial world than in the VC world. And it's happening faster in VC than in mainstream. So I think it's going to, in a sense, I mean, I think a lot of mainstream companies do a little bit of greenwashing and, you know, trying their best, but they're not necessarily, it's hard to turn a company and suddenly make it socially impactful. It's a lot easier to do a startup. And so I think you're going to see a wave of entrepreneurs doing more of that. I also think that COVID has exposed some big problems that I think we are all aware of. You know, cities that were polluted. You know, I think a lot of kind of tensions around inequality happening by race, by age, by a bunch of other metrics. You know, car-dominated cities, and I think people are really stepping back and thinking about new models. And in fact, if you look at productivity, it's tended to be very concentrated in, you know, technology, the Fortune 1000 that are, even though they're slow, at least they've got digital transformation programs. Where you're not seeing it is in areas like construction, which has actually gone backwards in productivity. It's had reverse productivity. You haven't seen it in government in many ways. So I think one of the questions is, how does this kind of new ethos not just stay in a narrow segment of the economy, but actually benefit a broader segment of the economy? And I think that's where a lot of the social entrepreneurs are going to go to, right? Create solutions around how can we build housing so it becomes more affordable. A lot of the inequality is ultimately about housing inequality. In London, in New York, in Boston, in San Francisco, it's really ultimately housing inequality. And a lot of that is tied to zoning and other regulations. So how do we sort of rethink our way through those regulations? And just like some of the startups of the last 5 or 10 years worked around, say, taxi regulations to sort of create new services. What are the new workarounds, and what? And I think the entrepreneurs are going to be going after that.
Yeah. No, and talking about new models, we do have a question from the audience here, which was, how do you think hiring and talent management will look like in the post-COVID world?
So I can share some thoughts from the entrepreneurial side. It's obviously going to be hard because you won't necessarily physically meet the person throughout much of the process, at least for the next year or so. So I think building references, building credentials that are validated, and finding multiple points of references, possibly doing, in a sense, work possibly for free as you're trying to sort of establish your value to your future employer may be part of it, and that could be difficult. One of the things that we're thinking through is the idea of almost an automated version of your resume that's much more intelligent and can also be a bit of a coach and sort of help you effectively use the power of AI and all these technologies to help you manage your own career. We're not always the best managers of our own career, and so we think about the equivalent of the Hollywood talent agency that could sort of help an actor figure out what's the next best movie to take. And so even if you're very talented at your job, you're not, say, talented at managing your job. So I think you're going to see the emergence of both people, but also tools that will help you do that better. But I think in many ways it's going to have to be a little bit like the digital economy. You often have to do freemium. You have to prove yourself in some way before you can get hired. And that means longer planning horizons and also a more diversified strategy rather than sort of being straight down the middle with one job. You may have to be managing kind of a portfolio of things, knowing that if you're angling for your next job, you better be sort of building value so that at the time you want to make that skip, you're ready for that, rather than the more traditional, I just finished one job, I'll go look for the next. I think it's going to be quite different.
Yeah. And Shivani, touching on that, what about talent management? So, you know, how do you manage a team, or how do you think about, you know, the networks that they're developing in an organization to move them up the ranks, right? Is that going to be different if you're not going to be having maybe those informal coffee chats or things like that? How do you manage and identify that talent a little bit differently in this world?
So Natalie, I'm hoping that it won't be 100% virtual world, right? And therefore, organizations will have to be very considered around those physical face-to-face interactions. And I think performance management and talent management will end up being one of them. Not in all instances, but in the key instances, it'll have to be, especially when you are looking to give particularly difficult feedback. When you're looking at succession planning, I think there will be some key moments where that physical interaction becomes very critical. I will say, however, that another benefit that's come out of the pandemic is that there has been an over-indexing on leadership engagement. And that's what people in the city have said. And again, I'm coming back to the knowledge workers. But what people in the city have told us in our research is that as junior employees, they've never had so much access to the senior most people in their organization. They've never spoken to them so much. They've never heard from them so much. And I think that should be something that you carry on once this pandemic is over. So I think that will have a positive impact on talent management as well.
Yeah.
So I think a bit more considered around when is it that you have that face-to-face interaction rather than all the time. I think the big loss is going to be around the informal coffee chats, water cooler chats, whatever you might call it. And I think they will need to be engineered virtually, which a lot of us have done, right? We've been having Zoom drinks and Zoom dinners and all of that. So people will find ways to innovate. And lastly, let's not forget that, you know, the lockdown will end at some stage. So even if you're not going into the workplace, you will get to meet people outside. And in fact, one of my clients, she lives down the road, and we need to have a phone call tomorrow, and we are instead going to take a socially distanced walk together and have a conversation because we are not able to go back to work. So I think we will innovate more when it comes to these kinds of topics.
Yeah, and you spoke just now about certain things being more re-engineered, right? So what will almost the role of the office be, right? These companies have invested millions of dollars and pounds into offices. If they're not going to be used in the traditional way, what will they be used for, right? And will it be more for those types of conversations that you really can't do so well virtually? How do you take advantage of that investment that was made previously?
So I think let's just accept one thing: the traditional working space is not going to go away, and it shouldn't go away, because for a lot of people, the reality is they can't work from home, right? So we will have to accept that. Whether people move out of London, London is still an international city. You'll still have people coming here to study and then work here for the initial years of their life. So they will want to come into a office workspace, right? So does the traditional hot desk kind of environment go away? No, but I think it'll be less of that. Where the workspace will be used more will be around collaboration, whether internally or with your clients, whatever your clients look like. So there will be that collaboration, innovation element that the workspace will be used for. And the second is going to be around socializing, because at the end of the day, for a lot of people, your work colleagues are a part of your social life. They're part of your social network, and you will figure out ways to interact. You need to figure out ways to interact with them. And at the end of the day, you want your teams to know each other well. So you will start using the workspace for the social aspect. And again, your clients come into that. So I think we are going to see more of collaboration in the workspace and more of socializing. So I think those are the things to see more.
And Dominic, your work style has been a little bit different. So you've been flying back and forth from the European to the American continent, and how do you see your workspace and your environment changing or impacted by this in some shape or form?
And I think at a very practical level, I think travel between countries is clearly going to get a lot harder for quite a lot longer, because you're going to have differential paths in every country. And so, for example, right now, for a while, the US was blocking people coming from Europe or from China. Now Europe is blocking people coming from the US. And so at a practical level, for the next year or so, a lot of business travel is just going to go away. So I think companies are going to have to find ways. As I said, I think we're still in that honeymoon period where we're working off the existing projects, but now as we're sort of spinning up new projects or new sales or new hires without any sort of legacy of having ever met them face to face, it's going to get quite a bit harder. And so I think what you could see it, for example, in business to business sales, you could already see a slow evolution from a sort of sales driven model towards a buyer driven model, where the selling process is much more about helping a buyer unlock a series of gates and solve a bunch of problems. And as they do that, they get closer to buying, and you almost don't need salespeople. And so I think you're going to see that kind of thing getting automated. I think small firms are going to do that. I think that also creates needs for people that are working for those firms to either reinvent themselves and find a way to work with that automation. So I think one of the big themes is that I think for every job, there's going to be a digital version of that job. And I think that the time to figure what that is now for a lot of people. I also see, as I said earlier, I think there are going to be some companies that haven't adapted because they didn't have the IT systems. Certainly in some geographies, I think it's proving harder. I think for example, in the US, already before COVID, there was a lot of automation, a lot of people working from home. And so it's really been an increase, but not a fundamental change in kind. I think in other cultures, it's less developed. So I think it's going to be a bit harder, but also in some segments like government and slow moving areas that haven't adopted technologies or smaller companies, it's going to be a more wrenching change. And you're already seeing that, for example, the stock market, right? The value increase has really come from 5 companies. Everybody else has gone down. And so you're seeing an increasing centralization of value to a small number of companies, with smaller businesses effectively losing. And that has some big long-term implications that are not positive.
I think you've pivoted us quite nicely into what some of the longer term or mid to long term risks of this situation are. And Shivani, you touched on it previously as well, which is, you know, how are you going to be maintaining those kind of relationships in this workforce, right? How do you create a company culture if you may have some people that are in the office, some people that are away? What do we need to make sure that we still have the pulse on our employees and creating that joint culture and relationships?
And I think that's where, Natalie, your operating model or the way you're organized starts to play a big role. Because organizations that are able to make teams more autonomous and delegate more down the line will succeed. Because I think we are seeing organizations that have done well in this area are the organizations that have always been more democratic, have had fewer hierarchies, have had decision making at the lower level, and for want of a better word, have trusted their employees more. You know, they don't overdo on meetings, and they're not really consensus driven. Like, not everybody has to be involved in every single decision. So I think somewhere, the more you push decisions down the line, the more you start operating as teams, you will find that people are engaging better, people are better motivated, and feel like, you know, they are contributing and are more certain about the contributions they are making. I think that shift will happen, and we are already seeing that. I mean, the conversations we are having with organizations around how do I start moving away from functional silos into more sort of cross-functional teams, you know, to use oft-repeated consulting jargon. But I think some of that in terms of how does your governance work, what role does the leadership play in some of the core decisions of the organizations versus what employees do. And I think the other bit is allowing the culture of an organization to be influenced bottom up rather than top down.
Mm-hmm.
So letting employees decide what do they want to talk about, what is it that the organization should be focused on. I think that will start to become more and more important, and we are already seeing that.
Yeah, you've seen some of that activism coming out from Google employees. That I think a lot of the Black Lives Matters discussions right now, it's very much bottoms up rather than top down. We have one question from the audience as well. So what do you think the impact is on project work for freelancers or people that are in the gig economy? I know, a tough one.
I'm happy to pick up on that. I mean, I think that one of the side effects of the remote work paradigm is that, in a sense, it does open up the world for external collaboration more, and for kind of people that are not employees to be able to contribute because they may not be in the same city, but they no longer have to be in the same city. I don't think that's quite happened yet, because I think most companies are rightly protecting sort of their employees and sort of working largely. I think in the short run, a lot of contract work and consulting work has gone away because companies want to give it first to their internal employees. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's been a bit of a recession for many gig workers that were doing those kinds of contracts. I think over time, it is actually going to create more opportunity. And I think one of the things you could start to see is really the nature of work starts to become a more networked and orchestrated.
Uh-oh, Dominic. Okay, we've temporarily lost Dominic. Shivani, can we go back to the question of creating company culture? Because we did get a comment here that they wanted a bit more details on how you create a culture in this environment, right? So I think it's always something that leaders have been very conscious about, and there's a lot of informal parts that go around to that culture. Do you see it being more more top down? You talked a little bit earlier about you know, leaders really reaching out to their employees. How can we work on this differently then?
So I think my first point of clarification would be, is it about creating culture or preserving culture? And I suspect it's probably the latter. It goes down to it goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier. What kind of organization culture have you had? Because if it's the kind of organization culture where even in the normal course pre-pandemic, you know, you had high employee engagement, you trusted your teams, there was greater autonomy at the team and even at the individual level, then I suspect you have responded to the pandemic better organizationally than the others who did not. Going forward, you would pull very similar levers around culture, which is, you know, leadership, the role of leadership, how often you're talking to your people, how do you engage, is engagement just top down or is it more bottom up, and also is it sideways? The role of networks within and outside organizations is going to start playing a part. So how many hoops do you have to cross or jump over to get to the other team to get work done, versus already having those networks in place, right? So that plays an important role. And I do fundamentally believe that this is the time where, not just because of what has happened with the pandemic, but the influence millennials and increasingly generation Z is having on organization, and you know, their population in organizations is only increasing. Culture will start to get influenced bottom up. I want to give you a couple of examples. You know, in the recent past, a few organizations have opened up their head office and they've said to people, you know, it's safe to come back to work. And in one case, only 2% of employees went back. And, you know, you have to wonder whether 20, 30 years ago, if that would have been possible, right? Employees would have said, my boss is asking me to come back to work, I am going to go back to work. But employees are choosing not to, and they're choosing out of different concerns, health and safety or work-life balance. I prefer working from home, it's working really well for me. And organizations are not throwing the rule book at them, right? So I think that just goes to show that the culture element is no longer something that the sole preserve of the leadership or the senior most people in the organization. It's being influenced across the board. So culture is also going to become much more democratic and it'll get influenced across the organization. And in fact, I believe that your wider ecosystem, your suppliers, your partners, you know, people who participate in your organization as contractors or whatever we might call them, will influence how culture takes place. And I also think that, you know, places like LinkedIn and the other rating sites where organizations get rated, they'll become much more important. They'll get used more.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. Dominic, we had a follow-up to your point, which was, how can independent consultants survive this shift? You know, how can they react and pivot?
So I think it's a hard one, right? But I think that companies are going to be automating everything and they're accelerating that. So if I were a consultant, I'd be trying to sort of figure out where the hockey puck is moving on automation, and it's now shifting towards hyper automation. So I'd be really trying to sort of, I guess, position myself as somewhat of an expert in hyper automation, and that's one of the niches that's developing. And I think it's a sort of symbiotic thing, because there's going to be a lot of technology, but soft skills will really matter a lot. And so trying to sort of figure out how to help companies in evolving is an interesting area. I think at the other end, there's going to be new cultural norms. So, but I think broadly is whatever you're doing, whatever your field of expertise is, firstly, make sure you're really on the digital edge and you're learning all the tools and techniques sort of slightly ahead of everybody else, because everybody is upping their game. So if you're just at the average and you're not sort of above it, like, be the first to sort of figure out new norms of etiquette. How do you manage an effective brainstorming session when everybody's on Zoom, and become really good at it? And I guess you just have to be one step ahead of the mainstream. The other thing is to, I think there are new ways of selling. So for example, you have a lot of embedded knowledge. Recording a series of videos that are effectively a way of offering that embedded knowledge can be a way of actually simplifying sales, because you can basically do all the sales pitches, automate them, put them online, and somebody doesn't have to listen to you. They just have to go and watch you on video. So you can actually get more views rather than the one-to-one, you can get many to one. So I think there's new possibilities, but it really requires to sort of reinvent yourself. And consultants tend to be very good at that. And then the last thing I'd say is, I think there's a huge potential in sort of fusion of multiple cultures, multiple generations, young people working with old people. And I think more of that is becoming feasible, because you could assemble a team on the fly from anywhere, put them together in a Zoom call and call it a project team, call it a company. And so those kinds of things that used to take forever can be done a lot faster. So I think there's a lot of possibility. But not everybody's going to catch on to that, right? So if you're just kind of like, I'm hoping it will come back to some version of normal, and you're not moving ahead, you probably are going to be left behind.
Yeah. And I imagine some of these independent consultants may end up trying to join one of the more traditional consulting firms. And so Shivani, we were talking earlier, and I saw on LinkedIn the survey that you just put out that you did with your teams and with millennials, and you were also talking a little bit more about the importance of job security for that group. Can you comment?
So I think the whole gig economy element is interesting, and you know, maybe Dominic can respond to this once I'm done talking. I think right now independent consultants are struggling, right? Because as organizations, and in fact, in this country, the government has put its arms around sort of permanently employed employees with furlough schemes, or actually taking care of your own employees. I think the independent gig economy worker has not found that support. And therefore, is there going to be an impact on the rise of the gig worker, which organizations like ours have been talking about and predicting that, you know, it's only going to rise? Are we going to see a plateauing, or in fact a steep fall in the near term in that sort of group of workers? But in the longer term, I suspect what's going to happen is that bit is actually going to flourish more, because organizations will realize that they can't afford to be as big as they are, right? They can't carry a big sort of permanent worker base, and they'll have to be much more stretchable, scale up and scale down very, very quickly. And I think therefore the reliance on super skilled and semi-skilled gig economy workers will come back, and I think it will ultimately achieve its potential that it's meant to achieve. So I guess that's one. I think coming back to the millennials and the Gen Z, we surveyed around 27,000 people, both pre and post COVID, and we started doing the survey around 4 years ago. In 2016 we did our first survey, and over the last 3 years the millennials and subsequent generations that we've included in the survey have said that they don't see themselves staying on in an organization for top 3 years. And this is the first time the response has been, I don't think I'm going to leave. And I see myself being here for 5 years or longer. And that's been unprecedented in the short history of this survey. And I suspect that's because of two reasons. One is the uncertainty that's coming with the pandemic and some fear a long drawn out recession, global recession. So people want to hold on to the jobs that they have. But the second data point that comes from the survey itself is that most of, I think a large percentage, almost 50% of the people we surveyed, they have given a thumbs up to the way their organizations have responded to the pandemic, and I think that has sort of given them a sense of loyalty to the organization.
So Shivani, if I understand right, what you're saying is that in the past people kind of wanted to leave, but the companies wanted to sort of keep them, and now you may see a flip that people really want to stay with large companies, and large companies may be saying, maybe I'm too large and I need to sort of actually lighten up. And so you may see effectively more people being pushed into sort of a gig economy, whether they like to or not. I think we're seeing that quite a lot in, I think, in people in their 40s and 50s. So quite a lot of automation is going to push people out of work. And so I think there is an urgency to create new models, and how do you work together, and maybe clusters of skills that can work together to sort of take on new initiatives. So there could be a whole new wave of consulting models that, rather than being a single person, maybe trying to sort of generate some power as a group of 5 or 10 people with a certain set of skills, kind of an Ocean 11 kind of thing, that can actually tackle problems. Maybe kind of something that emerges out of it.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
I'm going to open it up for questions now. I do have one last poll that I'm going to also launch. So we talked a bit about the risks, so we'll see what the audience thinks in terms of what are some of the risks of the transformation that's going on, and then see if there's any questions from the audience. So while we wait for the answers to come in, one of the topics that I've seen quite a lot of information about has just been general mental health, right? And I know that in my organization, at least, there's been a huge amount of trainings on mental health and dealing with mental health during the pandemic. Do you see companies shifting to have a broader role in helping employees through that going forward? Or is this almost just a unique time in history when we're focused on that, given all the stresses that are going on?
I don't think so, Natalie. I think the well-being, mental health has been on companies' agendas for the longest time. I think what has happened is that the manner in which it is being addressed has shifted quite significantly. So it started off with, why don't you take this gym pass and make sure you're using the gym once or twice a week, or here's a Fitbit, or download the sleeping app, and once in a while a dietitian will come and talk to you about good eating habits. So it was very project based, and there was some team that was looking at mental health and well-being as a nice to have. But what has happened now is that mental health and well-being in many organizations is now on the boardroom's agenda. So that's one. Organizations are putting them money and effort where their mouths are. And the second thing is, mental health and well-being is now part of the work process. It's embedded in the everyday. So you're checking in on your teams and making sure that they're not on Zoom calls 8 to 8. The fact that you are addressing their stress, their anxiety, and clearly, again, this is one thing that's been very much bottom-up driven, because the millennials, Generation Z, are much more at comfort about talking about their stress and anxiety, and the older generations have sort of tried to be that super resilient group that doesn't want to talk about it, right? But so this is what's happening. It's not a program anymore. It's part of your everyday work.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that will be very much the case as well. Dominic?
Yeah, if I could sort of add, if you sort of peel the onion another layer and say what's often behind mental health issues, I think you have caring for loved ones, whether they're young or old, or your spouse. I think it's a huge issue. So I think the caring economy and rethinking that, and how do you enable that to happen. I think financial insecurity. So if people are spending, most of their wages into their mortgage or their rent because they're living in an expensive city is a big issue. I think that the long commute, I think the lack of flexibility, right? So I think a lot of things that are mental health can also be attributed to actual real stresses on your day-to-day life. And so I think in addition to sort of coaching and sort of gym memberships, I think companies are going to be looking and having to look at quality of life that may be more structural, and how do I design my business? I think, you're seeing some very interesting companies now come up, like GitHub, distributed work models, where they're really designing quality of life into the DNA from the outset. And I think some of those companies have done very, very well. And that could be the future model, right? So there may be some great startups, and as a VC, when we typically start a company, we typically want them to be in the same office together, because there's all that learning that goes on in the early days. But maybe the new model is going to be actually begin as a distributed company and build in that quality of life that allows mental health to be an output of a really good company design, rather than if you have a design that's going to force you to commute, live in an expensive city, have a lot of stresses, not give you the flexibility to deal with your care ones, no amount of coaching is going to actually make that better.
And I think, Dominic, just to add to that, another important bit is going to be role modeling. One of the biggest successes we've seen in Deloitte is, our partners standing up and talking in front of people about their personal mental health, anxiety, stress issues, taking time off from work, how they have personally dealt with it. And you can just see that shifts the conversation, and more people are then willing to talk about it and seek help, both at work and personally. So I think the role modeling element should not be downplayed in this.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because that's probably something that in the past has been almost hidden. So it's hopefully we're bringing to the fore a lot of challenges, and we'll have a more exciting career and work life going forward. I'm just going to touch on the results of the polls, and we've got one more question for you. So I thought it was interesting if you can, did I share the results of the poll? Yes. So the results of the poll show you that people are quite concerned about, career progression and networking post-COVID. So that's obviously something to keep in mind, and that, we'll have to make sure we're supporting people through that. And then, potentially an uneven playing field if you then have some people that are working a bit more from home versus office works. And so, it has been an even playing field right now, everybody virtual. As you move to a different one, there may be some I guess, disadvantages coming out for certain people. So do you want to comment on that before I move to just the final question?
I voted for career progression and networking, so I agree with the result.
Good. So now we have two more questions, but I'll go for the first one first, which is, how will an INSEAD MBA add value in the post-COVID job market? So, and I'll take that because I'm an INSEAD alum, but the class at INSEAD right now, who obviously are having to do all their classes virtually, has been very impacted by this. And so what the school did was they sent out a notice to all of the alumni and said, how can you help this cohort, right? And was more proactive in terms of supporting them with either side projects or freelance work or volunteering, and ideally also offering them work. So in a world where potentially, that ad hoc networking may become a little bit more difficult, having that built-in network of INSEAD, I think is a great advantage to people that have it. And then we have one more question, which is, despite working from home has become the norm in this period, and a majority of workers and employers have discovered the advantages, I did not see many job offers specifying work from home so far. Oh, my question disappeared. Wait. Oh yeah, there you go. Can we expect employers being more hesitant about the work from home model than workers? And Dominic, I see that you already answered it, so go for it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think if you Google great companies for remote work, there's probably like 100 startups with strange names like GitHub and Envision, some interesting B2B unicorns where 50% of their workforce is work from home, and they're very oriented around that. I think you're obviously going to see Facebook and others do that for the existing employees, but they're probably not yet hiring. But I think it's going to be definitely a growth category, but right now it's pretty niche-y. I think one of the challenges is if you want to get to a remote first job, you probably have to have a strategy to do that, which may include really boning up on new skills. I think one of the broad themes here for me is whatever you have or whatever you've done, kind of throw away the book and start and really rethink about new skills. And for example, doing something like this, right, where you're working at Barclays, Natalie, but you're also hosting a session like this, which is sort of a digital new normal etiquette. So the more things like that that you're doing and developing those skills and networking your way into a remote first job. I mean, I happen to know both my daughter and her husband are now in remote first jobs, but it probably took them a couple years of planning and job shifts to get to that point. I think it will happen faster, but it won't just happen because I think the share of jobs that are today defined that way is still very, very small.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. We're around for another 5 minutes. If we weren't in this situation, we'd all be going downstairs or to another room and having a couple of drinks together for some unofficial questions. But hopefully we'll get back to that at INSEAD sometime either later in this year or definitely next year. So Shivani, Dominic, thank you so much for your time. I absolutely love the session. I could continue asking you guys questions about this very interesting topic for a long time, and sharing stories as to how individual companies have actually, and individuals and companies have been reacting. Any closing thoughts from either of you? And if not, we'll say good night.
Thanks for having me, Natalie.
My pleasure, Shivani.
Thanks as well. And if anybody's got any questions, I assume you know how to reach me, but I saw there was a good group and very good questions. So even though I'm not an INSEAD grad, my sister lives in Fontainebleau, so I have a strong affinity to the place. So happy to answer any questions afterwards.
You're always part of the INSEAD family once you've come into an INSEAD event, right, Shivani?
Very good.
I'm married in INSEAD also.
Yes. Good. All right. Well, thanks a lot and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.